Journal number 4, continued, Pendragon. The Malago miners charged out of the forest. The attack was on. The Bedouin knights didn't budge. They wanted to see what these bold peasants had planned. The first line of miners stopped and loaded their slingshots with tack. On command, they flung their explosives at the waiting Bedouin. The small tack bombs flew across the battlefield and exploded on impact, but they had fallen far short of the front line of the Bedouin defense. If they were going to do any damage, they were going to have to get closer, which meant they had to put themselves within range of the Bedouin archers. The Bedouin, on the other hand, were surprised by the explosions that blasted down in front of them. Except for the quig that had been blown to bits in the stadium, they had never witnessed anything like this. There was a movement along the lines to retreat, but the Bedouin commander wouldn't let them budge. They were going to hold their ground. The Bedouin commander sent a line of shield carriers to the front. These brave men stood in a line like a barrier of steel and flesh to protect their comrades from the incoming missiles. Behind them, the archers stood ready to release their arrows as soon as the Malago miners were in range. This was going to get real ugly, real quick. But I didn't know any of this until afterwards. Right now I had my own problem to deal with, which was St. Dane. There was no way out. We were trapped by 2 cave-ins that were caused by Figgis's booby traps. The only way out of this seemed to be through the flume. But it might as well have been a mile away, because standing between us and the gate was St. Dane. "You brought the tack here, didn't you?" I spat at the guy. "I did no such thing," he said, acting all innocent. "Tack is natural to Pendragon. Figgis discovered this vein several years ago." He walked over to one of the walls and scraped off a layer of dirt with his hand. As the dirt fell away, I saw beneath it the familiar rusty red color of tack. I looked to Lore, and for the first time since we met, she looked scared. That's because she realized, as I did, that this entire cavern was made of tack. The bomb we had dissolved in the stadium was like a firecracker compared to this cavern, and we were standing in the middle of it. "Figgis thought the miners could use the tack to help them the tunnel through the rock," St. Dane explained. "It was noble of him, but he was a merchant, and he thought like one. He wanted to help the miners, but he also wanted to make a profit." The evil traveler walked over to the skeleton that used to be Figgis and nudged the bones with his foot. I can't say that I blame him, but his greed proved to be his undoing. He set traps all over this cavern to protect his precious find. Unfortunately, one of them backfired. He kicked Figgis's skull, and it rolled away from the body and landed at our feet. I wanted to kick it back just to keep it away from me, but that would have been gross. "So you came to Pendragon and took his place?" I said. "And you showed the Malago miners how to use tack as a weapon?" "Of that I am guilty," he said with a proud smile. "But we stopped you," Lore shot back at him. "Relin did not use the bomb." St. Dane answered this with a laugh. I didn't like that. When bad guys laugh, it means they know something you don't. "But it is better this way," he said with smug authority. "If that bomb had blown up, it would have taken much longer for the Malago to regroup. Now, once they have won their little war, they will be strong enough to begin their march across Pendragon. I suppose I should thank you, Pendragon." Oh man, was it possible? By preventing that bomb from going off, did I make things worse? "And what if they don't win the war?" I asked. "What if the Bedouin win?" St. Dane brushed more dirt off the walls, revealing tack. "No matter," he said with a shrug. "There is an endless supply of tack. It may take time, but the Malago will come back. They will find new ways to use this lovely weapon. It is inevitable, Pendragon. This will soon become a territory at war. Pendragon will fall, and when it does, it will be the beginning of the end of Hala." Hala. There was that word again. This was all about Hala. On the battlefield above, the Malago miners had crept closer to the Bedouin knights. They were now within range to slingshot the tack in front of the line of shield carriers. The frightened Bedouins huddled beneath their shields as tack bombs smashed into them. With small explosions, the tack burst on impact against the shields and threw a blast of fire into the ranks. Several of the Bedouin knights died right there. Others got smart and realized it wasn't a good thing to let the small rock bombs hit their shields. They began to dodge out of the way rather than shield themselves as tack bombs rained down, setting off explosions that tore up the ground. That's when the next line of Bedouin knights began sending their arrows. They were too far away to take direct aim, so they arched their arrows high into the air toward the Malago. The black little streaks shot across the sky and rained down on the Malago silently. Some found their mark, others struck harmlessly into the ground. But there were enough arrows in the air to prevent the Malago miners from flinging their tack uncontested. Watching all this from a safe distance from the battlefield were the rest of the Bedouins and the Novans. They had spread out along the grassy bluffs to witness the spectacle as if it were a show put on for their amusement. Children played, musicians performed, and food was passed around as though at some kind of summer festival. Queen Kagan was positioned in the center of it all and stood on her throne to get the best view possible. In the Malago village, Uncle Press had found Alder, and the two of them tried again to warn the villagers to hide in the mines. The villagers knew Uncle Press, so at least they didn't slam doors in his face, but time after time they got the same response. To a person, the villagers were prepared to do battle with the Bedouin. It didn't matter if they were women or children or the elderly or the sick. None of them feared death, nor did they fear the Bedouin. Their only fear was having to continue to live the horrible lives they had been born into. No, these people were not about to run and hide. If the Bedouin knights got past the miners, they would be ready and they would fight. Frustrated, Uncle Press and Alder ran quickly to the battlefield. Arrows rained down in the Malago, while tack bombs scattered the front lines of Bedouin. Uncle Press and Alder were stymied. They wanted the Malago to defeat the Bedouin, but not with tack. The true enemy here was tack. But if they somehow convinced the Malago to stop using it, the miners would be overrun by the Bedouin. It was a no-win situation. And speaking of no-win situations, St. Dane had just said something that scared me to death. He said that the fall of Pendragon was the beginning of the end for Hala. Uncle Press said Hala was everything that existed, every place, every territory, every time that ever was. If St. Dane succeeded in destroying Hala, did that mean that the entire universe would be destroyed? The thought was too huge to comprehend. "Why do you want to destroy Hala?" I asked. St. Dane laughed. Great. More laughing. I hated that. "You as much you do not know, but I will say this. When Hala crumbles, I will be there to pick up the pieces." That sounded ominous. "I don't believe you," I said. "How can one man control the destiny of the entire universe?" St. Dane ran his hand over the wall of tack. "It is like lining up dominoes," he said. "Pushing over the first domino takes almost no effort, but when it falls, it knocks down the next and the next and the next until before long there is nothing left but a pile of toys in complete disarray. The territory of Pendragon is my first domino." It was true. Pendragon was only the beginning. St. Dane would then turn to the next territory and the next. It would only be a matter of time before he worked his evil on Lor's home territory of Zada and set his sights on our home, on Second Earth. "Your mother is dead," St. Dane said to Lor. But what about the rest of your family on Zada? And you, Pendragon, what of your family on Second Earth? And your friends, what are their names? Mark and Courtney? When the dominoes fall, they will all be caught in the crush." I wanted to scream. It was like he had read my mind. This guy was evil. "But this does not have to be a tragedy," he said with an oily smile. "Think of it as an opportunity. You two are strong. You have powers that you cannot imagine. If you joined me, I would teach you how to use them. Fighting against me is impossible, but fighting with me can bring you untold rewards. You could protect your loved ones and live to rule Hala beside me. It is a wonderful thing I am offering you." On the battlefield above, things were getting worse. The Malago had been able to keep the Bedouin back while suffering only minor casualties. The Bedouin side of the field was a mess. There were fires burning everywhere, and tack had chewed up the ground. However, the Bedouin casualties were very few. They had mostly managed to avoid the incoming tack. Now the Bedouin commander realized that the incoming bombs were slowing down. The Malago were running out of their strange and horrible weapon. Relin watched the action from behind the spear carriers. His worst fears were coming true. The Malago had used up most of their tack bombs, yet the Bedouin were still a mighty force. Soon they would be out of tack altogether, and the Bedouin would overrun them. Their only hope of victory was to strike while the Bedouin knights were still back on their heels. Relin needed to summon every bit of courage he had in order to do what must be done. He stood up behind his miners, grabbed a spear, and shouted, "Freedom!" The miners screamed in defiance and ran across the field toward their enemy. The Bedouin commander seemed stunned that their peasant miners would have the audacity to challenge his vaunted knights, but if a fight was what they wanted, he was willing to oblige. He motioned for his spear carriers on horseback to come forward. With a sweep of his hand, he sent the knights charging toward the oncoming Malago. Alder and Uncle Press watched in horror as these two tribes ran to meet each other in the center of the field. Queen Kagan jumped up and down, giggling with delight. Only one thing was certain. It was going to be bloody. In the mine below, St. Dane waited for our response to his offer. He had asked us to join him in his mad quest to control all that exists and threatened that our loved ones would die if we refused. It seemed as if we had run out of options. The guy scared the life out of me. I hated looking at him, so I looked down at the ground. What I saw there started me thinking. I saw rusty tack dust stuck to the Bedouin shoes I had been wearing. I kept my head down and looked around the small cavern to see that tack dust was everywhere. It coated the floor and the walls and even seemed to hang in the air. That's when I remembered something. It was something I had done a while ago without thinking. I didn't know it at the time, but it might turn out to be the key to saving Denderon. My mind raced. If I was going to make a move, it had to be now. I had no idea what was happening in the battlefield above, but after what St. Dane had said, it really didn't matter. This wasn't about the Bedouin or the Malago. This was about a horrible weapon that would change the course of a peaceful territory and send it to ruin. If anything must be stopped, it would have to be the supply of tack. To be honest, it scared me to think about doing what I was about to do, but I didn't see any other choice. I wasn't even sure if it would work. I might end up looking like an idiot. No problem there. I was used to that. But if it did work, there was a good chance that Laura and I would die. Neither outcome was exactly a good one, but it was clear that I had to give it a try. St. Dane, I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking with fear. I believe you. Laura shot me a surprised look. She didn't know where I was going with this. Yet. I can't explain why we're travelers, or how it's possible to travel through flumes, or how you can do the things you do, but I've seen enough to know that it's all real. I don't know if you have the power to bring down the universe, or Hala, or whatever you call it, but I do believe that you can cause a hell of a lot of trouble. If toppling Denderon is the first part of your plan, then I can't let you do it. I could feel Laura stiffen next to me. She knew I had something in mind, and she wanted to be ready. St. Dane watched me with a smug smile and said, "And how do you plan to stop me?" "I'm not," was my answer. "I'm going to stop the supply of tack." That's when I reached into my pocket and pulled out the little ball of tack that I had taken out of the ore car in the stadium. I had put it into my pocket before closing the door to the Quig pen. Now this little piece of explosive clay could be the only hope for Denderon. As I wrote before, I wasn't sure if this would work, but what I saw next to me made me think it just might. For as soon as I pulled it out, I saw something that I didn't think was possible. St. Dane blinked. The smug smile dropped off his face, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart leap. I saw fear. Up until then, he had orchestrated everything that had happened on Denderon. But things were about to change, and he knew it. Seeing this in his eyes gave me a shot of confidence. I looked to Laura. She nodded. She knew what might happen to us, but she also knew that it was the only way. We were seconds away from salvation, or doomsday. The battlefield above had erupted into a clash of bodies and clubs and horses and steel. The Malago were driven by their hatred and anger, the Bedouin by their training and strength. It was going to be an even fight, which meant both sides were going to suffer huge casualties. The worst of the fighting was about to begin. St. Dane made a move to stop me. "No!" he shouted in panic. But before he could take a second step, I threw my little ball of tack down at the ground. There was an explosion. Not a big one, but big enough. The small ball of tack erupted and shot out a blast of flame. The explosion didn't do much damage, but that didn't matter. It was the flame I was counting on. The small, hot burst of fire ignited the tack dust on the floor. Instantly, the tiny little bits of tack began to burn. It looked like a 4th of July sparkler on the floor of the cavern as the dust ignited and shot up into the air. But more important, the eruption began to spread. With each passing second, the fizzing and popping circle of sparks grew larger. There was so much tack dust on the floor and in the air that this fire had plenty of fuel to burn. St. Dane jumped at the expanding ring of sparks and desperately tried to stamp it out with his feet. "No, no!" he shouted at me in anger. For all his ability to manipulate people and twist them into doing his dirty work, he was powerless against this simple growing fire. There was an unlimited amount of fuel, and as soon as it grew big enough, the sparkling ring of fire would ignite the large vein of tack that ran through the mine. Once that happened, well, we'd all find out soon enough. St. Dane gave up trying to stop it and shot me a look of hatred that froze the blood in my veins. "This isn't the end, Pendragon," he seethed. "Don't be sad, St. Dane," I said. "This is the way it was meant to be." St. Dane looked as if he were about to erupt with anger. His icy blue eyes flashed with hatred. I must have pushed a pretty raw button to get him that ticked off. Laura thought he was going to attack us because she took a threatening step toward him, daring him to charge. I think he might have done it too, but he took a quick look around at the rapidly growing fire and decided to back off. "Until next time," he said, then turned and ran out of the Malago tunnel. The sparkling ring of tack fire was growing larger by the second. It was like a fuse that couldn't be stopped as it got closer and closer to setting off the mother of all bombs. I had no idea how much time we had, but if we had any hope of surviving, we had to get out of there. "The flume!" I said and ran toward the tunnel. Laura was right after me. We hit the mine tunnel and ran straight for the gate that led to the flume. The wooden door was already open because St. Dane had the same idea. As I was about to turn into the doorway, I heard St. Dane inside. "Chloral!" he yelled into the flume. We ran inside the gate in time to see the sparkling light that was St. Dane disappear into the depths of the flume on his way to... What is chloral? I asked. It must be another territory, Laura answered. Let's not go there, okay? I said. We should go... Before I had the chance to say another word, we both saw something in the flume. The sparkling lights and musical notes were heading our way. Was St. Dane coming back? As the lights grew closer, I heard a sound that didn't make sense. It sounded like water. We took a curious step closer to the flume and saw that it wasn't a traveler headed our way at all. It was an actual rush of water coming through the flume. What was St. Dane doing? Was he trying to put out the fire? The answer was no. He was trying to prevent us from escaping through the flume. But it wasn't just water he was sending back. There was something in the water, and it had teeth. Swimming toward us through the flume was a giant shark. As impossible as it sounds, the thing must have been 20 feet long and was headed straight for us, jaws first. There was one other thing I remember. It had vicious, glowing yellow eyes. We didn't have time to move and were both hit with this crushing wave of water. The force hit us so hard that it sent us both hurtling back out of the gate and slammed us against the far wall of the tunnel. That force of water was the only thing that saved us. If we had stayed at the mouth of the flume, we would have been rudely introduced to shark teeth. I got my head together, grabbed Lore, and pulled her to the side just in time because the huge yellow-eyed shark was propelled out of the gate and it smashed head first into the far wall of the tunnel. It was now a fish out of water, literally. It squirmed and thrashed in the mine tunnel as its giant jaws bit at the air only a few feet from our heads. I tried to crawl away, but saw that Lore was unconscious. She must have smashed her head when she hit the wall. I grabbed hold of her and was able to drag her farther back into the tunnel in safety. Did I say safety? We may have gotten out of range of the monster shark, but the fuse was still burning on the tack mine. We had nowhere to go. We couldn't get to the flume because there was a 3,000-pound thrashing shark in the way. We couldn't get back through the small tunnel to the Bedouin castle because of the cave-in. The only place we could go was deeper into the mine. To make things worse, if that was possible, Lore was unconscious. I tried to shake her awake, but it was a no-go. Her lights were out and I was looking down at a dead weight. It's amazing what adrenaline will do, because I stood up and was actually able to pick her up and get her on my back in a fireman's carry. I had no idea how much time we had left, but moving slowly was not an option. I tried to run with her, but it was hard. I couldn't get very far this way. We got past the entrance to the tack mine, and I glanced in to see that the entire floor was ablaze. The place looked alive with mad fireflies as the tack dust sputtered and burned. I didn't take the time to stop and admire it, though. I had to get us further into the mine. That's when I saw something that could help. It was the wooden ore car. If this thing still moved, I could put Lore inside and push her the way Alder had pushed us before. With Lore still on my back, I gave the car a kick. It moved. Yes! Without worrying about being gentle, I dumped Lore into the empty car. I didn't think she'd mind a few bruises under the circumstances. I quickly jumped to the back of the car and pushed. It moved slowly at first, but with each turn of the small wheels, it picked up speed. I kept both hands on the cars while pumping my legs like football linemen hitting a blocking sled. I went from a crawl to a walk to a jog and finally to a run. I had no idea where this tunnel would lead, but we were on our way. The thought flashed through my head that we might hit a piece of damaged track that would send the car crashing into the wall. I also feared that the tunnel would reach a dead end that we'd hit at full speed. That would hurt. Or a wheel would fall off, or I thought of a million other things that could derail our escape, but none of them mattered. This trip wasn't about caution, it was about speed. If we had any hope of surviving, we had to get as far away from that burning vein of tack as possible. And then I heard it. It started as a rumble and quickly grew like an earthquake. It felt like a freight train was barreling up from behind, but I knew what it was. The burning dust had finally reached the large deposit of tack. The chain reaction had begun. The rumble was actually a series of small explosions, and those small explosions would set off bigger explosions, and bigger until, well, there would be a very big bang. I didn't stop to think about it. If anything, it made me push harder. I could feel the ground shudder. The finale of this baby was going to be 1,000 on the Richter scale. On the battlefield, the miners and knights felt it too. Alder described it as the ground beginning to move under his feet. The fighting continued until they realized the shaking wasn't going to stop. One by one, they dropped their weapons and backed away from each other. There was now a more frightening enemy. Queen Kagan stood on her throne and threw a fit because the fighting had ended. Before she had the chance to order anyone to continue the battle, the ground shook and knocked her throne over. She tumbled down right along with it and lay flat on the ground, scared to death. The rest of the Bedouins and the Novans did the same thing. They all fell to the ground in fear. The fun and games were over. Uncle Press and Alder didn't move. They knew it was futile to seek shelter, so they stood together and waited for the end. They weren't going to have to wait long. The rumbling grew louder. It began to sound more like deep, booming explosions. As I pushed the cart with every bit of energy I had, I began to feel heat at my back. The tack mine was probably a blast furnace by now. I'm sure the shark was already roasted. It wouldn't be long before the whole mine blew. Up ahead, the tunnel was growing brighter. We were reaching the end, but I had no idea what that meant because I was crouched down behind the ore car pushing for all I was worth. Still, whatever was up there meant we had a shot at getting out. So I dug down even deeper and pumped my legs even harder. The faster we moved, the brighter the tunnel became. We were definitely nearing the end. Now the tunnel was shaking so violently that I was afraid it would throw the ore car off the track. If we didn't get to the end soon, it would definitely be the end for us. I don't know why I realized what was about to happen when I did, but I did. It hit me about 3 seconds beforehand. Maybe it was some kind of survival instinct, but whatever it was, those few seconds prepped me. As we were hurtling down that tunnel with the force of the exploding tack at my back, I remembered about the layout of the mines. We were flying along a track that ran parallel to the tunnel under the Bedouin palace. I knew where the tunnel ended, and that meant this tunnel would end the same way. This was a ventilation tunnel that led to the ocean bluffs. We were about to be launched out of the end, where there was nothing waiting for us but a long drop to the sea. And that's exactly what happened. Without breaking stride, I pushed the ore cart off the end. 1 second I was running, the next second we were falling. I tumbled out of control, not knowing which way was up. I was desperate to see the water and get my body in a position to take the impact. If I hit head first, I'd break my neck. So I corkscrewed into a position to avoid that. Splashdown was a second away. Believe it or not, the last thought I had before hitting the water was, "Lore can't swim!" There's only one word I can use to describe the feeling of hitting the water at that speed. Rude. It was just plain rude. I was able to twist myself around so I hit on my side rather than my head, but the impact still knocked the breath out of me. What a jolt! It was worse than when I beefed it off the sled into the snow after the crazy sleigh ride down the mountain. But I didn't lose consciousness this time. Good thing. I didn't want to drown. After all we'd been through, that wouldn't be fair. I came to the surface and looked back up at the opening to the mine. The fall was a big one, maybe 30 feet. But that's not what concerned me at the moment, because I also saw that the entire wall of the bluffs was shaking. Remember, these were cliffs. It was like looking up at a wall of skyscrapers. If this thing came down, we'd be buried. I looked around quickly and was relieved to see Lore was floating near me. She must have fallen out on the way down. I swam to her and listened to her breathing. She was alive, but I didn't know how badly she was hurt. All I wanted to do was swim as far away from the bluffs as possible. I also found the wooden ore car that had been our transportation out of there. It was floating right next to us. Luckily, it hadn't hit either of us when we fell. So I got Lore on her back, brought her over to the floating ore car, and grabbed on. We had a better chance of surviving with this lifeboat than my swimming skills alone. I wasn't sure what direction to go in, but I soon realized I didn't have a choice. There was a swift current running parallel to the shore that swept us along. We weren't moving farther out into the ocean, but we were moving steadily away from the mines. It was a good thing, too, because that's when it happened. Ignition. The whole world exploded. The sound was like a deep, powerful growl from a giant demon trapped below ground and struggling to force its way to the surface. A second later, the ventilation shafts along the bluffs blew out, spewing huge blasts of flame that shot over our heads like rocket engines on full power. There must have been 20 openings, all breathing fire that streamed 100 yards out over the ocean. The water began to churn and roil. It took everything I had to keep Lore and myself afloat. The bluffs themselves seemed to be out of focus, but that was because they were shuddering from an immense force that was tearing them apart from within. My thoughts went to Uncle Press and to Alder. They were up there somewhere. If the top blew off like a monster volcano, they'd be done. Mark, Courtney, what I saw then will haunt me until the day I die. The eruption had begun a good 30 seconds before, but the powerful flames continued to jet from the holes in the bluff with incredible intensity. I allowed myself one small bit of hope that most of the force of the exploding tack would be funneled out through these openings. Maybe these man-made openings would act like release valves to get rid of the force of the explosion before it destroyed the land above and everything living on it. That's when I heard the sound. It was different than the rumble from the explosions. It sounded more like something was cracking. If you've ever heard the sound that a big tree makes in its last moments as it falls to a lumberjack's axe, That was what it sounded like. It's a horrible screeching sound as the tree tries to hold on to the last sinews of its trunk. That high-pitched, tearing sound was what I now heard, only multiplied by 1,000,000. I looked up to my left to see where the sound was coming from. Imagine a huge 5-story castle carved into the bluffs that was the Bedouin palace, and it was about to fall down. The horrible creaking sounds were the palace's last desperate gasp at trying to hang on to its perch, but it was no use. The force of the exploding tack was tearing it apart. Cracks appeared like spider webs all over the stone's castle. For a moment I thought it would dissolve into 1,000,000,000 pieces, but with one last groan the giant palace pulled free of the bluff and slowly began to lean over. In a final, thunderous crack, the palace let go and toppled into the sea with a monstrous splash. If the swift current had been running the other way, Laura and I would have been right under it, and though we were clear of the tumbling palace, we weren't safe yet. When the huge building hit, it created a monster surge of water that was headed right for us. If we didn't ride this thing, we'd drown for sure. So I faced the oncoming rush, prepared to ride it like a wave. We both rose with the huge swell and came down on the other side safely. Unlike regular wave sets, there was no second wave to worry about. This was a one-time phenomenon, and we had survived it. Once the immediate danger had passed, I looked at the castle, or should I say, at what was left of it. The giant structure had hit the water and rolled over. One whole side was above the water. I looked up to the bluffs to see a gaping scar that used to be the palace. The only thing left was the heavy columns it had been built upon. I then realized that the flames had stopped shooting out of the mine air shafts. The rumbling had stopped too. The explosion was over, and we were still alive. Now all we had to do was get to shore. I tried to push the ore car along, but that was more trouble than it was worth. So I kicked the car away, but not without a nod of gratitude, for it had saved our lives. It didn't take long for me to get Laura to shore. When I got up close enough for my feet to touch sand, I stood up and put her on my back with the fireman's carry again. It wasn't easy. My adrenaline surge was gone, and along with it, most of my strength. So after a difficult struggle, I fell to my knees and slid Laura off me onto the sand. Then I collapsed. I figured that as soon as I got my breath and Laura woke up, we'd make our way up to the bluffs to find Uncle Press and Alder. I feared for what we would find up there, but didn't have the energy left to worry. I wanted to enjoy being alive for a few moments, so I laid down on the sand and closed my eyes and crashed. I think I had earned it.